Over the past few months, I've covered each film in Christopher Nolan's filmography, and during that process, I realized that he might be the most consistent filmmaker ever. Some may even consider him to be the greatest filmmaker ever. And while I am a fan of his movies, I'm not trying to give him that title just yet. Though if The Odyssey is up to his usual standard of quality, his case would be much stronger. So, in anticipation of that, and to cap off this retrospective series on his career, I figured I'd rank every Christopher Nolan movie. Throughout the review series, I saw comments on almost every single video saying that whatever film I was discussing was Nolan's best, and then in that same comment section, someone would say it was his worst. So there's clearly room for a wide range of opinion. Part of that is because of the obvious fact that art is subjective, but another reason is because of just how consistent Nolan is. On a technical level, it's hard to place one of his movies above another. Taking that into account, it goes without saying this ranking is going to be entirely subjective. So if you disagree with any of the placements, definitely let me know in the comments. And to clarify the rules of this ranking, only feature films that Nolan directed count, so no DCEU or short films. And one last thing, I'll also be placing the movies into a tier list, and I'm mostly doing this in an effort to future-proof this ranking. My opinions tend to change constantly. It's one reason I don't do number ratings in my reviews and why I hate Letterboxd. The entries will still be individually ranked, but as my opinions change over time, things may shift around within those tiers. It's highly unlikely that at any point in the future, any of these films are moved to a different tier though. I hope that makes sense. With all that being said, let's get started with the ranking. Starting off the ranking, we have Nolan's directorial debut, Following. Nolan made Following with a budget of only around $6,000, and somehow managed to tell a pretty solid noir story. Considering the budget, Following is very impressive. The actors do a fine job, the music is good, the editing is solid, it's more than watchable, which is saying a lot considering its place on this list. I actually really like Following, but there are a few reasons I can't justify ranking it higher. While Nolan working within the limitations of a $6,000 budget is impressive, there are still noticeable technical cracks throughout, which are exceedingly rare in his later work. Also, Nolan employed his typical nonlinear storytelling for Following, and of all his films, it feels the most out of place here. There isn't a reason for the story to be told the way it is, other than it making a simple narrative a bit more engaging. I do think the nonlinear narrative does actually improve the movie, but I would have liked some sort of explanation for why the story is told this way. Perhaps something like what Oppenheimer did, with the hearing serving as a guide to the rest of the narrative. Maybe every so often we could return to the protagonist being interrogated, and this conversation could transition us to the next event. Also, while I do appreciate how succinct this narrative is, 70 minutes is just a bit too short for me to really get invested. Still, there's a lot to love about Following, and I definitely don't want to be too hard on it. Honestly, the fact that it even released as a coherent and enjoyable movie in the first place is a miracle. It may not be anything too special, but it's solid, and definitely deserving of your time if you're at all curious about how Nolan's career began. Insomnia is Nolan's third project, and the only film in his filmography that he didn't write. It's a remake of a 1997 Norwegian film of the same name, which leads to it being by far the least Nolan-like Nolan movie. All in all, it has a solid premise, but it's executed in a pretty bland way and plays out exactly as you'd expect. Honestly, I went back and forth between Insomnia and Following's placements for a while, but the reason I ultimately decided to place Insomnia ahead was because of Robin Williams' performance. He does a phenomenal job here as the antagonist, and was by far the best part of the film. I don't want to give off the impression that this is a bad movie, because it actually is pretty good. It just isn't really my thing, and I don't have much to say about it beyond that. This is definitely the Nolan film that my opinion fluctuates the most on, and that almost entirely comes down to how much of an apologist I feel like being on any given day. The Dark Knight Rises is fundamentally flawed, yet it still contains some of the highest highs of Nolan's entire career. That being said, it also has the lowest lows of Nolan's career. At times it feels like Nolan has a story he wanted to tell, and a plan in mind for this trilogy since the release of Batman Begins. And other times, it feels like Nolan just wanted to get Rises out of the way so we could move on to Interstellar. The idea of a villain taking over Gotham and plunging it into complete anarchy sounds great, and the many references to A Tale of Two Cities and the commentary on class inequality feels genuinely inspired at times. But it's all handled about as clumsily as it could have been. The plot borders on nonsensical, and there were several strange story decisions that completely took me out of it. Like all the cops going into the sewer, the conveniently placed nuke, the fact that Gordon just so happened to have the letter on him when he was captured, and don't get me started on Talia al Ghul. It really is a complete mess, but I can't bring myself to hate The Dark Knight Rises. The scene of Bruce escaping the pit is an all-time classic, and most of the action sequences are phenomenal. Not to mention the cinematography, specifically the use of IMAX, is amazing. Every time I talk about The Dark Knight Rises, I come to the same conclusion though. The thought of watching Rises is great. Actually watching it though is a bit frustrating. I understand why a lot of people love this movie, and I do definitely enjoy it for the most part, but unfortunately, I just can't look past all of its flaws. At least not enough to place it above the other films on this list. Batman Begins was Nolan's first ever big budget film, and this movie being as low as it is should be proof this list is nearly impossible to make. I'm shocked this one isn't higher, but really it came down to just one thing. The highs of Batman Begins aren't nearly as high as many of the films placed above it. Still, it is consistent all the way through. I love nearly every second of Batman Begins, and to this day, it's probably the greatest superhero origin movie ever made. It takes a while before Batman even properly shows up for the first time, yet that first act is still entertaining. Nowadays, it's a pretty traditional comic book movie, but at the time, it was revolutionary. And as someone who actually enjoys superhero movies for what they are, I do have a lot of respect for Batman Begins. I really only have two complaints. First is more of a nitpick than anything. That line at the end where Bruce decides not to save Ra's al Ghul is genuinely just stupid. Not saving someone when it's easily within your power to do so is the same as killing them. And my second complaint is Katie Holmes' acting. I understand that a lot of people didn't like Maggie Gyllenhaal in The Dark Knight either, but I easily prefer her over Katie Holmes. Despite these small complaints though, Batman Begins is a classic. Dunkirk is in a very similar boat to Batman Begins. It's a really solid film all the way through, but its highs just don't compare to some of the later entries on this list. It is absolutely beautiful though. The soundtrack is great, it has some genuinely heartfelt moments, and its narrative has a lot more nuance than it's given credit for. The reason I placed it over Batman Begins is because, unlike that movie, I really don't have any complaints about Dunkirk. Sure, the characters are one note, and it is much shorter than a typical Nolan feature, but these things really don't detract from the movie in any way. Dunkirk's another one where I don't have much else to say about it. It's one of my only reviews where I feel like I genuinely covered everything I wanted to in that video. It's just a very fundamentally sound movie, without a whole lot else going on. I know a lot of people probably saw this placement and immediately were confused. I criticized The Dark Knight Rises harshly for its flaws, yet Tenet is several places above it, and there's a simple reason for that. Tenet just isn't nearly as flawed as many people think. Its highs aren't quite as high as The Dark Knight Rises, but its lows don't even compare. Rises seems to get worse the more you think about its plot, whereas Tenet just gets better and better. Still, Tenet isn't anywhere close to perfect. Its puzzle-like plot structure, while unique and very interesting, isn't handled perfectly, and some of the criticism Tenet receives is warranted. But I still love Tenet. It's very creative, the visuals are incredible, the soundtrack is one of the greatest ever, and it might be the single most rewatchable movie ever. I honestly expected Tenet to rank a bit higher, but especially at this point in the list, it has a lot of tough competition. This is the first coin toss of the list. Memento and the movie in 5th place could honestly go either way, but for this ranking I've decided to place Memento lower, just because it's probably Nolan's least technically impressive project. No crazy practical effects, IMAX, or intense action sequences. That's really not what this story is meant to be though. Memento is incredibly unique, and I've honestly never seen a film quite like it. The nonlinear story isn't too difficult to follow on a first viewing, and it feels justified given the main character's condition. By making sure that the main character never knows more than the audience never really feels lost. And on a second viewing, everything really clicks. And a big reason for that is the editing. The sequencing and transitions between scenes are great, which ensures the whole thing flows as one cohesive narrative. All of this not to mention 3 great performances from the leads and that chilling ending. Memento is definitely one that sticks with the viewer, and seeing as it was Nolan's first real film, it makes sense that Nolan was able to build from this to become what he is today. I honestly didn't expect Inception to end up this high on the list, but I really enjoyed it on my last rewatch. As I mentioned, this spot can go back and forth between Inception and Memento, but as of right now I prefer Inception. Inception features Nolan's second most creative gimmick behind Tenet, the difference being that this one is executed a whole lot better. I often call Inception the quintessential Nolan film, and the reason for that is because it contains almost everything the typical Nolan feature has. A creative concept, it messes with time, it has well-spoken characters, insane practical effects, and excellent music. Though Nolan is somewhat reinventing himself with Oppenheimer, and from what I can tell, The Odyssey, Inception is still fundamentally Nolan. Inception is often regarded as a classic, and that's for a good reason. It really is phenomenal. The emotional beats land really well, and there's a reason that iconic ending is still talked about to this day. It really doesn't get much better than Inception, but we still have 4 films to go. This is where the subjectivity of this list really shows. I absolutely love The Prestige, and honestly, the best answer I can give for why is that it's just cool. The many twists and turns in the narrative are very entertaining, but there's still more than enough depth here to be enjoyed on repeat viewings. I still find new clues hinting at the twist after several rewatches, and The Prestige is a film I could never get tired of rewatching. Though it is simpler than a lot of Nolan's other projects, I honestly don't mind that at all. It fits the setting and keeps the focus on the characters. The rivalry between Bale and Jackman's characters is just so much fun to watch, and that ending somehow gives me chills every time. Also, I have to mention Rebecca Hall's performance. I really feel like her contributions fly under the radar since she has a smaller name than the other leads. But behind only Christian Bale, she had one of the best performances in the film, which was essential in making the most emotional moments in the story work. If you disagree with this placement, I completely understand, but The Prestige will always be a masterpiece in my eyes. And this is the second coin toss of the list. This and the movie in second place can go either way, but I've decided to go with Oppenheimer at 3 for today. Not much I can say about it that I didn't just say a couple weeks ago in my Oppenheimer video, but it really is just a phenomenal movie. The technical prowess on display in Oppenheimer is clearly Nolan at his best. Story, cinematography, music, and editing are all fantastic, not to mention the cast being one of the greatest ever assembled. If I had to come up with an excuse as to why it isn't one spot higher, I guess I would have to point to the underwhelming Trinity test, but in a film that does everything else perfectly, it's tough to hold that against it. Also, I do have to mention that ending montage. It's a truly incredible moment that brings together every motif set up earlier in the story into one thrilling, poignant sequence. It's by far one of Nolan's most powerful projects, and if you have it higher on your own list, I can absolutely understand why. What can I say about The Dark Knight that hasn't already been said? It's one of, if not the best superhero movies ever made, easily one of Nolan's best films, and perhaps even one of the greatest of all time. It's the definition of a classic. It was also Nolan's first time using IMAX, which would later go on to be a defining feature of his career, and the use of it in that opening sequence in particular is still jaw-dropping. Heath Ledger's Joker deserves every bit of praise that he gets, and the many twists and turns in this narrative are just incredible. It features some of the greatest sequences ever put to film, and I still struggle to find fault with it to this very day. As I mentioned though, it was a coin toss between this and Oppenheimer. I love both movies, but in the end I gave it to The Dark Knight because of my personal history with it. I've been watching The Dark Knight for years, and I'm still not sick of it. It's by far one of my most rewatched films. It still remains to be seen whether Oppenheimer will have that kind of longevity for me personally. Either way, I love The Dark Knight, and while the choice between second and third place was tough, the number 1 spot was by far the easiest of the list. If you had told me after my first viewing of Interstellar that I would eventually like it more than The Dark Knight, I wouldn't have believed you, but here we are. Interstellar is just fantastic. It's beautiful, emotional, the soundtrack is amazing, the performances are incredible. I titled my video on it, Why Interstellar is Life-Changing, and that really has proven to be true. Interstellar changed the way I thought about humanity, and specifically the bonds that tie us all together. Also, space has always really interested me, so there's bias in that regard as well. The point is that this incredible story is in a setting and is delivered in such a way that it has had a tremendous impact on millions of people. It's a work of art in the truest sense. It took me a bit after my first viewing to fully appreciate Interstellar, but I truly am glad I came around to it to appreciate it for what it is. The greatest work of Nolan's career and one of the greatest films ever made. Well, that's my list. Definitely leave yours in the comments. As I mentioned, there's room for a wide range of opinion in any Nolan discussion, so I'm curious to see which films you guys appreciated the most. And with that, the Nolan retrospective is officially over. At least for now. Thank you to everyone who watched these reviews, which made this series possible. I hope to continue with many more like it in the future. For now though, I have kind of a random series I wanted to cover. I've gotten a lot of requests for Blade Runner 2049, so I figured I might as well cover both Blade Runner movies next. So look out for that in the coming weeks. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks again for watching.